Welcome to our podcast, Schizophrenia, Three Moms in the Trenches. From the place where schizophrenia and real life collide. East Coast, West Coast, Middle America. With Miriam Feldman, Mindy Greiling, and Randye Kaye. Finally, a place to talk about the truth. And welcome to this kind of spontaneous episode 46 of Schizophrenia, Three Moms in the Trenches. And this came out of a conversation Mindy and Mimi and I were having after we all saw a New York Times Magazine article that was published. It was by David Bergner, who's a journalist, and it's based on his book, The Mind and the Moon. And basically the article subtitle is "A New Movement," which we know as the Hearing Voices movement, wants to shift mainstream thinking away from medication and toward greater acceptance. And the article reports on a point of view of psychosis through the eyes of a woman named Caroline who has hallucinations and has engaged with the Hearing Voices movement and now refers to them as non-consensus realities. And the concept is that by lifting the pressure of secrecy and diminishing that feeling of deviance, talking about the voices can loosen their hold and make us less isolated, which I'm all for. But underneath all that, it seemed to us that there was, and always has seemed to me with Hearing Voices movement, that there's a feeling that medication should be stopped. And I don't know if that's true or not, but we all immediately saw an incredible YouTube video by Freddie, who, if you're watching on YouTube, you can see right now. And I'm going to hand it over to Mimi because you did the contacting. So
okay. Well, first, Freddie, how do you pronounce your last name?
deBoer.
deBoer. That's what I'm talking. Okay, so this is Freddie deBoer. Hi, Freddie. This is something that we all have talked about and thought about. And when that article came out, I just looked at it inside and shut my computer because it's just like it's so distressing to see. And I've wanted to talk about it, and so have my partners, but we have a little bit of difficulty with that because, there's this whole nothing for us without us movement. And also, we're three moms. We're not three people experiencing this. And so what we get is, oh, yeah, you're just the moms. You just want to control everything. You just want, there not to be a problem. So you're medicating them. And so we lose a certain amount of credibility. Now, that really, it's certainly not our intent, the three of us. And I've yet to meet a mother to whom that's her intent. But it makes it a little tricky to talk about. And I think it's important because I think these kind of articles in the movement, the Hearing Voices movement, is doing a terrible disservice to the vast majority of people who are dealing with psychosis disorders. I look at their approach and their attitude toward it, and it's like, God bless them. If they can go through this and have auditory hallucinations and psychosis and just deal with it without medication. And we do know people who do that. So, more power to them.
yeah,
But
amen,
again,
yay.
yeah, but again, our friend David Israelian, who was on the show, he has serious voices and he has learned to deal with it. And he's amazing, but he's the first person to stand up and speak for medication. So anyway, here you are, and we'd like to hear, we saw this video that really moved all of us, and I've seen it passed around on social media now. And so here you are, Freddie. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what brought you to make that video?
Yeah, I'm 40 years old. I'm a writer. I have a PhD in applied linguistics. When I was 20, I had a psychotic episode, and I was diagnosed with bipolar mania. I was taken to an ER where I was strapped to a gurney and injected with Haldol. I ended up in a psychiatric facility for a long period, which is where I was diagnosed. I emerged from there with some prescriptions and follow-up appointments. And I lasted less than 3 months on meds. And the sort of following 15 years was a period of a very consistent cycle of being okay, because I have a cyclical disorder. And so there would be periods of time in which I was not ill, and which would make it very easy to convince myself I could live without medication. I would gradually become manic. That would lead to very dangerous and unpredictable behaviors. I had very common patterns of accusing people who were close to me of disloyalty, of becoming extremely paranoid about people hacking into my bank account or putting things in my food, which would eventually lead to legal scenarios in which I would, basically have to go back onto medication. And when I would go back on medication, the meds would come with a series of problems, but I would become stable. And then I would go off meds again. And that happened, like I said, for 15 years. And I should say that all of this is very common for people with managing bipolar disorder. This is not at all an unusual scenario. And then finally, when in 2017, when I was 36 or so, the same cycle happened. I ended up threatening to kill someone in a voicemail, which shows you what a criminal genius I was at that point. And they said, if you go to the hospital, I still might call the cops, but if you don't go to the hospital, I'll definitely call the cops. And so I went to the hospital, and just for whatever reason, this was the one where it was just like, it had become clear that if I was going to have anything like a normal life, I had to be medicated for good. And I've been medicated now for 5 years. And so, so that's my story. And so I am someone who, is well aware of all the downsides of the medication. But when I am off meds, I ruin my life. And when I'm on meds, I don't. And that is, I think, a simple wisdom that seems never to be included in these pieces, which I just feel like some version of this story gets published like every 9 months or something. Like it just seems like this is a story that the mainstream media is so desperate to tell, without any balance of talking to people like me who need medication and have had their lives saved by medication.
Wow. And I will tell you that just, today, if you're listening, whenever you're listening, today is Sunday in the middle of Memorial Day weekend. And my son, who I call Ben in the book, so I call him Ben for the purposes of this podcast, he is also 40 and his diagnosis is schizophrenia, and just had a bit of a setback because when his life isn't going the way he would like, he turns to pot. And then if he could, he's living in a group home where medication is a requirement, but it's by injection. So every month we live with the possibility that he'll say no to the injection. But he's downstairs right now playing with his nieces and nephews, and actually agreed to have his injection 3 days early. And in the car, and he had a job interview also this week.
Oh, wow. Wonderful, Randye.
I know, it's amazing. And yet, when he said, look, I'm on the meds, and I'll tell you, Mom, I don't need them, but I need them to stay in my group home, and I need them to see you. So we are never going to agree that I have an illness, and we are never going to agree that I need medication, but I'll do it for you. And part of me was a little bit like, well, just like, can you just think about every time you go off them, you go in the hospital? And he started to get angry. And I had to go back to one of my mantras, which is like, it's not my job to convince him he has schizophrenia. It's good enough for me if he takes the meds for me. That's, that has to be okay. And so, of course, there's a part of me. And if you're new to our podcast, we are 3 moms. We each have sons with schizophrenia. We've stood by them. We support them. We advocate for them. We also set boundaries so we take care of ourselves. And we've each written books about it, not as money makers, but as hope spreaders. And so I know that there's a part of me that says, oh, I wish he would listen to this podcast. And I know you have bipolar, which is more cyclical, but you have dealt with psychosis and you came to this conclusion. And so that's the frame of mind I'm in today. And I want your YouTube video, which I will put a link to in the show notes, was so emotional. You just turned on your camera and started talking. And can you tell me about the process of seeing that article
Mhm.
and what compelled you to turn on your camera and just make this video, which is probably has at least 6,000 views so far.
Something like that.
Yeah.
I just find it, look, like there are people who have problems with blood pressure who don't have to take statins, right? There's people who are able to manage heart disease with diet and exercise, whatever, and good for them, right? Like that's great. There are people who are able to manage psychotic disorders without medication, and I'm happy for them. What bothers me is that, first of all, this article and articles of this type never attempt to say what percentage of people suffering in this way can actually manage it that way, right? So like think about like the concept of like living with the voices. To be able to live with the voices means that the part of your brain that can comprehend that you are hearing voices and that they are delusions has to be working normally. In other words, your disorder can't obscure the fact that, in fact, there are no voices being heard, that those are the product of a mental illness. Some people, like the people interviewed in this article, have the ability to do that, where their schizophrenia does not obstruct their conscious mind's ability to understand that the voices are not real. Right. But of course, for many, many people with schizophrenia, that is precisely what their disorder does not allow them to do, right? They can't grasp that the voices aren't real because that is what their brain is telling them is the truth, right? I mean, one of the tragedies of these psychotic disorders, I have a very paranoia dominant mania. So it's kind of similar to that in the sense that like the part of you that is not being believed by the public writ large, the doctors you're talking to, whatever, the delusional part of you, right, is the part you want to protect because that's the part your brain is telling you is the higher truth, right? They're out to obscure my reality or whatever. And so a patient who doesn't have the ability to actually separate, okay, some things I hear are real and some are not, is not going to be able to live with the voices in a meaningful sense. I also think that it's unfair and irresponsible to not talk about the fact that, as I understand it, just about half of the people who have schizophrenia or diagnosed with schizophrenia have what they call like negative symptom schizophrenia, meaning that they are extremely withdrawn, they gradually lose engagement with the world, they become nonverbal, they sometimes become catatonic, right? People like that are as big of a picture of schizophrenia as are a violent, paranoid, delusional schizophrenic, just in terms of the population. But what would it mean for those people to live with the voices when the way that their disorder represents itself is they gradually just remove themselves from the world, right? Them just sort of accepting, they are perceived by many people to not be a problem because they're not violent and they're not threats to other people. But their disorder is still severely restricting their ability to live a happy and healthy life. And
Eddie, those are the invisible people. And there are so many people with schizophrenia who are like that. And that it's such a tragedy because you hit the nail on the head when you said they're not a problem to society. And this is sort of how treatment for schizophrenia is driven, is let's just eliminate the part of it that is a problem for the world we don't want to look at or deal with. And it's perfectly okay within the approach for treatment to call a success a person who is medicated to the point of being in a stupor, to being almost catatonic. And that's a success. And all three of us have had our sons handed back to us as zombies and said, here, we fixed them. Yeah. And that's not good enough for us. And that's such a huge majority or a huge proportion of the people with schizophrenia. And there's nobody out there speaking for them.
I mean, and I really appreciate.
I'm sorry. No, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, I really appreciate your video because I felt like you were speaking for them, even though you have bipolar disorder. My son, who's 44, so he's just a few years older than you, has schizoaffective disorder, bipolar type. So he very much has your illness plus schizophrenia. So we have the cycles. And also some of the other voices or issues, including voices, but I felt like you were speaking for him. And that video that Mimi sent to us, your YouTube, was just got me so emotional too, because I was so happy that you were speaking out. As Randye said at the beginning, we're three moms, so your voice is so much more powerful. So I'm pleased that you do it. And a regular podcast. Am I right? Did I notice that when I was looking at your YouTube, or is it a regular YouTube?
So I have a newsletter and I occasionally post videos. There's no rhyme or reason to like what I sort of think is video worthy with this. I was so emotional. I just wanted to get it on there. I want to say real quick though, and I think this is important. This idea of that the only people who can speak on a subject are the people who themselves so the only people who could speak on schizophrenia are people with schizophrenia, that sort of idea. Number one, I think that is, that sometimes is called standpoint theory in academia. And I think that that's just a very debatable notion in general, right? Because like the idea that the best people to speak on a subject are the people who are most implicated seems directly wrong in certain circumstances, right? Because if you look at, for example, battered wives are notoriously have a difficult time recognizing their reality as battered wives because they are in it, right? So I wouldn't want battered wives to be the only voices, right? So that's one thing. But the other thing is that you guys are speaking from a point of being in it. You are speaking of your lived experiences as the parents of people with schizophrenia. And that is just as valid and just as important to the conversation. For every one schizophrenic person, there's a whole constellation of family members who have to live with that person and manage their problem, right? My commitment to treatment, if it was just about me, if I was truly alone in the world, there's no doubt in my mind that I would remain unmedicated and I'd be in and out of institutions and I'd be unemployed, right? The thing that compelled me to finally get my act together and to really stick with medication was my family. And, my younger brother had to come up to New York from Washington, D.C. and go to an institution, and negotiate with my insurance company. And, I'm there, I'm 36 years old and my younger brother has to come rescue me again. And it was that sort of compelled me to get back into treatment for good. And so the notion that like the family members of people with schizophrenia have less inherent ability to speak is just not correct, right? Because they're bearing the brunt as much as the person themselves are. So
thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Powerful, just like your video.
thanks.
One thing I wanted to add, you mentioned, we're talking about the journalists, and my daughter is actually a journalist. And so believe you me, I'm going to be discussing this with her this weekend. I'm going to see her where I'm going to Washington, D.C. for my granddaughter's high school graduation. And so I'll be discussing this, but I think there are, obviously some really tuned in editors and journalists on this topic. And I think she is definitely one of them. I have to say, I was shocked that the NYTimes magazine would publish such a one-sided piece, that they did not take the time to talk to anyone from other major mental health groups, other people like you who are very articulate on the other side. I mean, the woman, this was a Caroline, you said, Randye, she did not have any of the appearances of the sort of illness that you were talking about, Freddie and Mimi, with the other half of people with schizophrenia who may not be violent or doing anything else, but they're living very marginal lives, or really, one might say, not much of a life at all. And if they were having active delusions, when my son is in that state, he's terrified, he's miserable, he wants to die. So the idea that people like him weren't represented in that article by the NYTimes, I thought was abhorrent and shocking.
Freddie, did you get reaction from the video, and what was it like?
Yeah, I got a lot of positive reaction. I heard from a number of patients themselves who don't feel represented in, I think one part of this is there's nothing sexy about saying, go to your psychiatrist, do your therapy, and take your meds, right? Like, that's not counterintuitive. It's not groundbreaking. It's not going to sound interesting or exciting to anybody. And the media loves narratives that are counterintuitive and that are different, right? But like, you know, if anyone asks me their advice for handling a psychotic disorder, go to your psychiatrist, do your therapy, take your meds, right? I mean, that's all you can do. But I heard from a lot of people who said, like, look, like, you know, number one, that they were like me, were in and out of treatment for a long time. And what held them back for a long time was their perception when they were psychotic, that, you know, their psychosis was some sort of like a deeper, more meaningful, more real way to live, right? That like the enemy of treatment for them was the perception that, you know, it was being unmedicated is a better way to be. And here you have the New York Times telling people, right, oh, this is the real you when you're not medicated, which is so irresponsible. I can't even believe it.
I know. Have you heard from when you're done, I want to know if you heard from the Times at all.
I got an email from Daniel Bergner, which was private, and so I won't share it, but he did reach out. But I heard from just a ton of people who said, you know, my younger brother struggled for 15 years and then killed himself. And when he was medicated, it was okay. And when he wasn't, it wasn't okay. Or my dad, you know, struggled with schizoaffective disorder until he died in a drunk driving accident. And we just always wanted him to take his meds, and we begged him to take his meds, and he wouldn't. And then that's why he died, right? Like there's just all these narratives from people who have borne the brunt of people's decisions on to take medication. You know, I did my dissertation on educational testing, and I write out a lot about education policy. My first book was a lot about education policy. And in that world, I often talk about the concept of like selection bias, which is things can look good because of the kind of students that go into those programs rather than the programs themselves. So a really common thing that will happen is, you know, there'll be like in a Montessori school in town, and a bunch of parents will send their kids to Montessori, and they'll have a great outcome, and the students will flourish, and everyone will feel good about it. And then you have a parent whose kid keeps struggling and just can't get it together. They say, well, I've heard so many good things about this Montessori school, I'm going to send him there, and then he doesn't do well, right? Because the kids who went to the school were a big part of this success solution. Right. It's the exact same thing with this, right? Like, I have no doubt that hearing voices is helping some people, and I'm happy for them, right? But I also have no doubt that I myself have been in institutions with people where I would be very, very frightened if they were put into a context in which they were constantly being told that they just have to learn to live with their psychosis. And for the record, one thing that I will note, I have had a psychotic disorder for 20 years. I've never heard voices. I think, you know, it's hearing voices for some people is very literal and real in the sense that they literally hear it. But there's a lot of psychotic patients, both schizophrenic and bipolar, for whom hearing voices is like a metaphor, right? Right. No one is whispering into my ear that my ex-girlfriend is putting glass in my food when I'm psychotic, right? It's just something I believe for no reason. I do think, like, I tell people often, like, don't go too hard, don't fixate too much on hearing voices as like in terms of actual auditory hallucinations, because that is not how it works for everybody, right? Like, there are schizophrenic patients who have delusions, right? But it is not the product of like literally they hear a voice. And sometimes I think that it gets overemphasized in a way that might alienate people.
Are there many groups that you relate to that help you?
Groups, yeah. So I do National Alliance of Mental Illness support group every week, online support group on Zoom. My girlfriend is involved with them as a volunteer, and you know, they provide a lot of free opportunities for people to do support groups, which are very valuable for me. But you know, directing people to treatment, helping people to sort of find doctors, things like that. So you know, I'm a fan of like recognizing medical problems as medical problems. I mentioned in a piece recently that what we used to say was, you know, you wouldn't stigmatize someone with diabetes. So why would you stigmatize someone with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, right? That I feel like that basic wisdom of that has kind of been lost for some reason, but these are medical disorders, and so they should be treated by doctors with the advances of medical science, right? And so people who, and I guess this is another thing for me, it's like, if people find that they are deriving real benefit from the model that's presented by groups like Hearing Voices, then that's fine by me. As long as they're getting the support, I don't care. But for me personally, I think there's a weird sort of philosophical element to this that I just don't vibe with. I have a problem that's a medical problem, and I want it to be treated by doctors and taken seriously as a medical problem, rather than seeing it as some sort of broader philosophy of life issue to discuss. And again, I think, so, you know, what I got a couple of emails from people like sort of talking about their time in 12-step programs, like Alcoholics Anonymous in that world, and how much they were helped and how their lives were saved by those programs. And one of the things that was mentioned several times was that the core to the 12-step philosophy is not that everything about you is fine, right? It's they don't say, oh, your alcoholic self is your true self. They don't say, oh, everything with you is fine and so you shouldn't feel stigma. They say, you have a problem and you need to change your life, right? And you need to surrender to the fact that you have this problem and you need to do the work to change. And so obviously there's differences between mental illnesses and addictions, but I do think that like there's this strange insistence that anything that we, as part of our identity, is something that we have to recognize as like, oh, it's part of me, so it's beautiful. And I don't feel that way at all about my bipolar disorder. I see anything beautiful about it. It has come very close to ruining my life on many occasions. And I just don't believe in the philosophy that it's something I should see as beautiful.
You know,
I love your
went to
analogies.
a seminar with Ellen Sachs. Are you familiar with her?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, with Ellen and this woman named Esme Wang, who wrote The Collected Schizophrenias, came out a couple of years ago. And she's also has schizophrenia. And somebody from the Hearing Voices movement raised their hand and, you know, presented this whole thing about it being special and wonderful and they're superheroes and it's a beautiful thing. And she doesn't understand why everybody's trying to change it. And both Ellen, who's my age, she's 66, and you know, she's been dealing with this for a good half a century. And Esme, who's young, both said, you know what? If I could hand back schizophrenia and not have it, of course I would do that. There's nothing beautiful about this. And I just found that interesting that they were so unequivocal about it. This woman was presenting it as though it was a way. I mean, it's very much in the zeitgeist. It's very much in our culture. Love yourself and love everything about you and you're okay and everything's fine. And I think that we have to remember that everything isn't fine. I mean, when you have stage 4 cancer, there's nothing to love about that.
There's a wonderful,
you know, there's so much in what you're saying. And I keep muting my microphone because outside is my son playing with his nieces and nephew, and it's very loud and beautiful. To me, that's beautiful. And yes, that's my perception. My son's staying up all night because he talked to a bush and God gave him the secret of life. That may have felt beautiful to him in his psychosis, but in terms of getting along in the real world, I don't even think he wants to live his life that way. He is trying to get a job in a toy store right now. And, you know, so it's, and he has a shot at it. So we'll see. But when you say there's no stigma with diabetes, I think there is an element of society that doesn't understand type 1 diabetes versus type 2. And, you know, it says, well, cure it with diet and exercise, or even with cancer, the people that are like, well, I think you attracted that with your energy. So there's always this element of society that wants to go there, maybe because they want everything to be okay. But anyway, enough about us. Just back to, we want to continue to let you tell your story. And I know that in your YouTube, you and I are both from Connecticut. So hello. You mentioned about something that happened when somebody you knew or witnessed was let out of the hospital too soon. And do you want to say a little bit about that, or should I just lead people to your YouTube video?
I mean, you can watch the YouTube video. One of the narratives that is almost impossible to avoid is the idea that we have this problem where the mental health system keeps grabbing people and pulling it into it, and they can't get out. And the doctors always want to keep people in, and everyone is over institutionalized. I think that narrative is not correct. Certainly, I think it can be the case that individual people can find themselves in places where they don't have advocates and where they are being, where their rights are being trampled on. Of course, individuals can have that happen to them, but in general, mental health is like any other part of healthcare, which is we have a problem with inadequate access, right? I mean, I think this is a little tidbit that I offer to people all the time. You can be forced into a psychiatric hospital and still have to pay for it, right? I think a lot of people don't understand this. You can have insurance and you can be involuntarily committed to a psychiatric institution, and the insurance company can still decide that is not covered, right? And there are many documented cases of this happening. So people will go in, the judge will say they have to go in, or whoever, and they will be in for a couple of weeks, and they'll come out with a $30,000 bill, and the insurance company will say, nope, sorry, we're not paying for that, right? It's hard to get treatment. Getting into therapy is a real pain in the neck, okay? So, I can tell you, I live in New York City, where there's probably more therapists per capita than anywhere, right? But it is such a pain to get into therapy, because you have to find people on your insurance. You have to find people on your insurance where even after the insurance payment, the copay is not too high, because I've been quoted $150 a session on top of insurance. You have to find people who are accepting new patients. You have to find people who are accepting new patients who can have a schedule that works for you. So back when I had a 9-to-5 job, I was told I went in to try to get into therapy. And after going through the whole process and the rigmarole, they're like, okay, your appointment is every Monday from 1:30 to 2:30 p.m. And I said, I have a job. It's an hour for me to get here and an hour to go back. I can't just disappear from my job for 3 hours every Monday. And they said, we can't help you. But the other thing is, many therapists will just decline to take patients with psychotic conditions. I know, because that's happened to me many times. I will go, I will do the intake appointment. They'll charge my insurance, obviously. And then they'll say, oh, we think you need to find someone who better fits your needs, because they don't want
the easy people that go to the hearing voices movement.
Right. And look, I understand that if a therapist feels, I'm not equipped to treat a psychotic patient, I get it, but it's hard, right? It's hard to find treatment. And so the idea that the problem is that everybody is over-treated is simply not the case. I have a friend who used to be a social worker in San Diego, and she spent so much of her time trying to find homeless people who had serious mental illnesses treatment, and was just stonewalled over and over again in terms of finding them treatment. Yeah. So the specific story for me is that when I was quite young, so I'm from Middletown, Connecticut, where Connecticut Valley Hospital is, and that is the only major psychiatric state psychiatric facility in the state. Most of the other ones are devoted to addiction treatment, and that has the big maximum security for violent patients wing still to this day. When I was 8, a patient got somehow accidentally let off the ward, who had twice before stabbed people due to his schizophrenic psychotic delusions. And he was released. He wandered down to Main Street, and we were having our annual sidewalk sale, which is this big community festival, and he stabbed a little girl to death in front of hundreds of people. And there's a lot of stories, if you dig around, about people who were clearly not ready to go back into the real world, but there was no one to pay their freight. And again, I think many people don't understand, so the last major law that John F. Kennedy signed into law was a big omnibus mental health bill. And it was the start of the institutionalization. And the critique was that, we have these institutions and they're awful and people get thrown into them and they're there for their whole lives and nobody takes care of the people. And there were definitely many things wrong back in those days for those institutions. So what they did is they closed a bunch of the institutions, and the idea was they were going to open a bunch of community mental health centers. And basically what happened was they closed the institutions and never opened community mental health centers.
Right.
So a ton of people basically got shifted from the institutions to the street, or from the institutions to the prisons, right? If you talk to people, many people just sort of assume, they'll say, oh, go get help, right? Oh, you have a mental illness, go get help, right? And they think there is some place where you can just arrive and say, I have a mental illness, help me out. And they'll just take you in and pay your way, right? But because, most facilities, there are even state facilities which are still charging you, for the record. But anyway, a lot of the state institutions were closed down. And so now you have private mental health institutions where someone has to pay that freight. Someone has to pay that bill. And if you don't have insurance, if you don't get prior authorization from your insurance company, which you almost certainly haven't if you're having a psychotic episode, then you can end up with just life-ruining medical debt because you have a psychotic disorder. Right. So I just think that the narrative of over-treatment is just not real, frankly.
You make so many good points, and we have just about 5 minutes left. So I want to make sure that you have the floor and you get to say, you have this platform. We've got over 40,000 listeners. And so we just want to give you a chance to, are there any more messages we haven't asked you about? Anything else you would like to say to our listeners, many of whom are family members of people with serious mental illness, but we also have a fair amount of listeners who have serious mental illness. So this is your soapbox. This is your platform. What else would you like to, what other messages would you like to get out there?
Yeah, so a few things. The first thing is that a majority of people who are prescribed antipsychotic medication eventually improve and recover to the point in which they no longer have to take their antipsychotic medication. I've been on antipsychotics now for 5 straight years, and before that I was on and off and on for a long time. Maybe someday in my future there's a time when I don't have to be, and there are people like me who are on them forever, for a long time. But a majority of people go off the medication when it's appropriate for them to do so. A majority of people who suffer from mental illness in this country receive appropriate treatment and go on to live perfectly healthy, normal lives, just the same as somebody who breaks their leg, gets treatment, and then moves on. Okay, there will always be chronic patients, and mental illness tends to be something that reoccurs throughout life for many people. But many people go and they have periods of mental illness in which they are treated and they recover, and that's success in medical science. And that those people are another example of a population that's just not adequately talked about in the media, where people get the appropriate treatment and then they recover. That's how it's supposed to work. Right. And so you need to understand that going in to get mental health care is not consigning yourself to a life defined as a mentally ill patient. The other thing is that, I would say to everybody who is potentially struggling in this way, you don't have to be clever. Like, you don't have to find a way to beat the system. You don't have to find some special way that you're gonna navigate it and you're gonna prove everybody wrong. Okay. Part of my problem was that I was always convinced that I was smarter than the doctors, that I was clever enough to figure out how to handle the disorder on my own, that I was too special to do the normal thing. And it ended up being, after 15 years of not getting it together, what I needed to do was to work the program that was being put in front of me. And
I'm smiling because that sounds so familiar with what goes on in our house.
Yeah. If I had been more receptive and open to the idea that I'm just like everybody else with a mental illness, and if I had just done what the doctors had told me to do 20 years ago, I would have saved myself and my family and people around me a lot of heartache. And the thing that I think these younger people don't understand, I mean, there's so many young people now who want to identify with their mental illness, and they plaster it all over their dating profile, and they think that it makes them so interesting. There are things you can't take back, And the thing that I know as a 40-year-old man that I didn't know as a 20-year-old is that you lose people for good. And the thing is like, looking back at my behavior, it was correct for the people who cut me out of their lives to do so, because I was unstable and I was dangerous. And you can't get those people back. You can never take that back. So my advice to everyone is don't be clever and don't think that you're too smart for the system and don't think that you can somehow rise above all this because you're so interesting. Work the program, right? Go to your psychiatrist, do your therapy, and take your meds. That's my advice to everyone.
Freddie, thank you so much and for sharing your story with us today. We really appreciate it. Is there anything you've written that you'd like us to point people toward, or just we'll put the link obviously to your videos on there?
Yeah.
Anything else?
Yeah, just so my Substack is, my newsletter is freddiedeboer.substack.com. If you Google my name, it's the first thing that pops up. And I've been writing a lot about mental illness lately, and just trying to sort of present, an alternate point of view that maybe isn't getting as much audience as it needs from the mainstream media. So feel free to check that out.
Thank you.
I
And
did
hope
check
the New
it
York
out, and I
Times
think
gives you a chance.
Other people should too. You've got a lot of really good topics that are on there.
Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you so much. Hey, thanks for joining us for this episode of Schizophrenia, Three Moms in the Trenches with Randye, Kaye, Mindy Greiling, and Miriam Feldman. To get in touch with us or to learn more about our books, please visit our websites at miriam-feldman.com, mindygreiling.com, or randyk.com.